Okay, maybe let's get started since we do have, we are 3 minutes in, so I think people will keep trickling in. Welcome to what I believe is the ninth of our Meet the Scholar sessions. My name is Asim Kaul. I'm at the University of Minnesota, and I'm a member of the STR Executive Committee, and I'm assisted today in hosting this conversation by Andrea Contigiani, who's at Ohio State and is part of our membership engagement committee. But obviously, our star attraction today is Dan Leventhal, featured here with his beard, but then featured on the next slide without it. So it's
Well
really been a
done.
hair-raising experience for him. Dan is the Reginald Lett Jones Professor of Corporate Strategy at Wharton, where he's been for over 30 years now, I think. Before that, he was at CMU. And before that, he got his PhD at Stanford in economics, business, and public policy with a dissertation titled Three Essays on Economic Models of Organizations, which in some sense, I don't know this is quite true, Dan, but previewed some of his more later work by looking at search behavior and adding search behavior to agency models. Dan has received basically every award imaginable except maybe the Nobel Prize, which we're still sort of waiting on. But he was the AIB Distinguished Scholar in 2019. He's received our very own BPS Urban Educator Award, as well as the OMT Distinguished Scholar Award. He's a fellow of the Strategic Management Society and in the Academy of Management. He's earned no less than 4 honorary doctorates. And so just, many, many, many awards, or not all of which I've managed to list here. Dan has also done, yeoman service to the profession. I think most notably in my mind by founding and running Strategy Science for the last 6 years, which some ways has been, I would argue, one of the most exciting developments in strategy publication in the last decade. Before that, he was also editor-in-chief of Organization Science and department editor for strategy at Management Science. So, tremendous amount of editorial work. He's been the chair of the Wharton Management Department. I mean, he's the person I think of as the chair of the management department because all the time I was there, that was his role, and it wasn't a short period of time. He's advised literally a legion of PhD students, many of whom would now qualify as distinguished scholars in their own right. People like Sendhil Ethiraj, Ron Adner, Giovanni Gavetti, Felipe Sasser, Brian Wu, many, many others who I'm sure I'm missing. And while doing all that, he's managed to amass, a mere 88,000 citations to his work on organizational adaptation, technological innovation, learning, search. Really, none of these concepts, I would say none of these concepts really exist without Dan's work. So very honored and delighted to have you join us, Dan. Thank you so much for doing this. Before we start, I'm going to actually stop screen sharing here. Just a couple of quick ground rules. If everyone could keep their audio on mute, that would be great. If I call on you to speak, you can always unmute yourself then. We're going to do about an hour of an interview with Dan between Andrea and me, and then we'll open it up to questions. But in the meantime, as questions occur to you, feel free to put them in the chat function. And at the end of after the interview, we'll come back and look at those. So with that, let's get started. So Dan, let me start with the sort of standard question. Why academia?
So for me, it was pretty easy. I was actually sort of born into it. My father was a faculty member at Stanford. He had kind of a unusual academic career, started out academic, industry, went back in various roles, but it's what all my parents' friends did. So why wouldn't you be in academia? Bright, interesting people doing interesting things. So it turns out actually I'm the youngest of 4. I was the only one who did that, maybe who fully got socialized or some other inclinations. But I know for many of you, you had to make this bold thing and you had to explain to your family why you're doing this, and I'm going to school and then I'm staying in school. But actually I didn't, that wasn't a struggle. I grew up in Palo Alto, California, and so Yeah, I think my father would have been happier if I like went off in physics or something, or, but I think, academia broadly was certainly okay.
Cool. Okay, but so you kind of joined the family business, as it were. Uh, but then, you're doing this, you're doing a PhD in this distinguished, respectable field of economics, and then you sort of go off and join this ragtag bunch of people doing strategy. What's that about?
Yeah. So their life gets a little more slightly complicated. So don't get the log cabin backstory, but I think economics appealed to me. How much do I really know? But formal. It's mathematics and it's social science. Like, what could be better? That seems pretty great. So this is what I should study as undergrad, and kind of interesting. And then as a junior, I blunder into this class taught by a new assistant professor, John Paget, in sociology. And it was an extraordinary class on lots of dimensions. So first, John starts out with this large amphitheater of eager people, which within 2 weeks, he turned into effectively a PhD seminar. One of the sort of tricks that junior faculty can do with a rather immense reading list and his kind of fairly demanding style. And it was amazing quasi-PhD. So, there were like about 6 or 8 of us who hung in as undergrads, a couple PhD students. And, we're reading working papers by Nelson and Winter. He had come from Michigan, so there's Bob Axelrod, a lot of this Carnegie stuff, March and Simon. I'm like, whoa, so I'm doing this economics and taking Howard Raif's decision theory class, and it's kind of okay, but here's this other whole world that really seems quite interesting that has some of the, I'm resonating more with. And so, slowly adapted that. Well, I couldn't apply to the org program. I'm still an economist. So I actually almost went to Yale, because then I had my first chat with Sid was as a prospective PhD admit, do I go there and stay with Nelson and Winter? And then, okay, Jim, I know this Jim Arch guy, but my foolish thought was that Stanford would be more accommodating. It's a business school. I can integrate my econ. I thought I had a background. What the hell, undergraduate? But it seemed like I had a background. And my interest in kind of what I began to think about as org theory actually turned out to be totally wrong. So Stanford, John Roberts had just arrived and was forming this very high-powered math econ group. And so I'm in that and basically moonlighting with Jim. And so to give you some early childhood context, so Bob Wilson starts out with my dissertation or research assistantship. A few years before me, Bob had a guy named Ben Holmstrom and then Paul Milgram. Paul, you don't know Bob Wilson, but he, rather important figure in sort of the math econ kind of world. And then I'm all right with Ken Arrow, who you do know, and with his agency stuff, but basically moonlighting with Jim, but going through this program. And so I end up with this this dissertation, which actually could have been interesting work. And actually, Barcelona cites it. It was actually so one essay became that I did for Arrow and Wilson, part of their grant, this sort of surveyed agency model. And then the core essay was actually important at the time. It was the first model, that's Barcelona notes and something he wrote, of two-sided moral hazard. But so here's I don't know, they're all faculty or PhD students will call. So how to really screw up your PhD life. So among the things, I added at the last minute this junior faculty, and I'm defending, he blew it up. It's like, oh, your agent's risk neutral. That's so messed up. Of course the agent would just take over the firm. What's the agency problem? And so I leave to go to Carnegie, and that is his own craziness, appointment as an ABD, so I can rewrite this damn essay and with much work get effectively the same results with now a risk-averse agent. And it was tricky. I talk a lot with doctors about the sociology of knowledge, and it's so fascinating because 3 or 4 years later, the math econ agency crowd said, we're running aground here. We've maxed out. How many models of risk sharing can we do? You know what? How about we screw it? We'll just let the agent be risk neutral. We can do some fun stuff. I was just a little too early before they decided to change those norms about what stupid assumptions we hold on to and which we kind of go. So I actually threw it in the garbage can because I like, okay, I'm starting to do this stuff with Wes and Mark Fitchman. But I had this kind of, so I had a schizophrenic doctoral student. And as a first year PhD student, I do this paper with Jim that became a reasonably big deal on model adaptive learning. So I'm sort of not being a fully integrated person living in those two worlds. And then just to add another footnote to this, doubling down on dumb decisions. So Carnegie was foolish enough to offer me, as a rookie, a joint appointment in the econ group and the organizations group, because Carnegie and Dan has this weird background, like why not? And I think, wow, this is where Jim did his magic. I should go to Carnegie, and sounds interesting. I'm going ahead of the story, but just to sort of, so the economist actually thought I was an economist. That was my job title, this agency model. It was kind of cool and fine. He'd sort of hang. And then I hang out with your people. I start teaching strategy. And actually, an interesting part about her, you're going to ask, you don't even have to ask questions. You just say one, you get my whole bio. But struggles or what have you. So I come up for my third renewal, and I have the publications, and I'm kind of oblivious doing my little thing. And it turns out they didn't want to renew me. Like, go figure. It's a renewal. You got to be kidding me. And sort of part of the irony is at the same time, they didn't want to renew me because the economists felt betrayed. And they particularly got energized around this throwaway piece, which actually was important. I ended up working with a doctoral student in marketing just because he had nobody to help him, and he was this terrific guy, and he's now a very distinguished professor at Duke. And his dissertation got the award for best dissertation in the American Marketing Association. But they hated that paper we did together, which ended up being a big deal in marketing science because we didn't derive the underlying utility function of it. But basically, it was I betrayed the true faith and true religion. But fortunately, at the same time, they didn't want to renew my contract. Are they going to penalize? It's just been 2 years because I'm not really a good person. Northwestern and Stanford were offering, went after me to promote me to associate. So actually, 9 months after they didn't want to renew me, they really decided with their immense rational expectation, rationality, clever forethought, actually what they really meant to do was promote me to associate. But I kind of, that whole sense of goodwill diminished. It actually was sort of at Wharton, I became a somewhat more, I picked Wharton in part, because okay, whatever I do will fit within management. Am I a strategy? Maybe I'll learn something about the strategy field by going to a place that actually has a strategy group. So I had a kind of prolonged adolescence or sort of confused phase one, but it maybe made me a robust actor for future work. But I think it's also, part of my often being a kind of outsider to conversations or sort of blending fields. And that's sort of, I grew up in a somewhat schizophrenic way, but ultimately slightly healthier adaptations of that. So long-winded answer to kind of complicated backstory.
Since you mentioned sort of the work with Wes, let's talk about that. I mean, so obviously, absorptive capacity is this kind of, huge piece that's been so influential in the field. I'd be curious to hear sort of the story of that paper. Actually, the papers, I guess, because there's the economic journal piece and then there's the SQ piece. How did you end up, where did the idea come from? How did you end up working with Wes? Just kind of the...
Yeah. So it's actually pretty simple. The genesis is I'm absentmindedly proctoring. I mean, back to my, so what was my teaching my first 2 years at Carnegie? It was really awesome. In the fall, I taught intermediate micro, and in the spring, I taught intro OB. Really synergistic kind of optimized teaching load. And then my third year, they needed somebody to teach strategy. Oh, whoa, that sounds like a good idea. One prep, and I don't have to decide whether I'm an economist, OB person. Yeah, sure, I'll do that. So while proctoring an intermediate micro exam, I was reading a back issue of Econometrica, and there was this article Mike Spence had, and it's this nice model of spillovers, and he ends up with this, it's a kind of charming model, it's Econometrica. At the end, gee, given all these spillovers, why are these firms, these semiconductor firms, are doing R&D? And I thought, well, I can tell you, Spence, because I'm a learning guy. Like, of course they, like, you're just assuming because it's out there, not protected on the property rights, like it's there, you know, anybody could stick their nose in the trough. And then me as a modeler, like, you know what? I can take his econometric model, add a new element. Let's call it absorbed capacity that changes with R&D. It moves up in some concave way. And as the modeler with my modeling intuition, I can flip his result. I bet you I can find conditions where spillovers go up and actually the incentive to do R&D will go up. And you know, as a modeler, I thought that was kind of cool. I happen to know Wes socially. And so while the spirit of the Carnegie, when we think of the Carnegie School, when I was at Carnegie, mid 80s, really lived in this quirky department called Social Decision Sciences. And Wes was there, Steve Klepper was there, Mark Hamlin was chair of it. So, and the one person I knew when I arrived at Carnegie was Mark Hamlin, so I knew Mark. That connected me to Wes, and okay, so I'm like with Wes, like he came out of Yale, he actually knows something about R&D and that stuff. So I tell Wes this, and those of you know Wes, you get pretty excited. It's like, oh, this is great, yeah. And so, you know, I could do the model, but Wes actually knew the context, and he and Dave Mowry had done a lot of work together and built a really amazing data set that gave them data at the line of business level of firms' investments. And Wes, being a Yale guy, was intimately familiar with the Yale survey that allowed us. So kind of, you know, I had my little theoretical insight, and Wes had his actual content, contextualized knowledge, and we're off the races. And so we actually, you know, you guys want to know the backstory, right? So we initially did just my kind of pure modeling exercise, set it to RAND, and like basically not enough game theory. I'm like, what the hell is a Nash equilibrium? Like, how much game theory do you want? Like, it's not fun. It's the same damn model that Spence published in Econometrica. Like, you know, but then Wes realized, you know what? Actually, I think we could actually do something empirical. And then we sent that to the Economic Journal, bless their heart, and worked out well for them as well. And then there was a special issue opportunity of ASQ that Dick Nelson and Mike Tushman were doing. And we thought, you know, we've kind of black boxed it because it was an Economic Journal article. Like, you know, absorbed capacity was a function. You stick in M and it goes up, you know. So maybe we could use that opportunity to try to, you know, unpack a little bit what's going on. And then we, you know, we did the Fortune Favors piece. But it's interesting, I think, maybe because like I went to Wharton and then a couple years later, West Coast and Duke, whatever. But you know, it's very gratifying. The world built on it, but right, maybe the world built on it even more and better because Wes and I kind of walked away. You know, it's in public domain, and people could kind of run with it, and it's really very, very glad. But I think back to your kind of initial, you know, there's the random garbage can element, but it is also reflecting the sort of intellectual recombination, you know. So I'm trained and socialized, well, enough by economists to understand and be able to operate within their frame of Spence's econometric, but I'm also socialized and acculturated to issues around word learning. And so, you know, I'm looking at their work from that vantage point, and I see this enormous kind of assumption, kind of, actually sort of funny, the lead paragraph of that piece, actually my parents were good friends with Ken Arrow, so the foil for that piece was actually Arrow and his kind of work as our kind of lead paragraph. But it's, yeah, kind of the virtue of being in both worlds. But, you know, in a sufficiently serious way that one could operate in both worlds.
So, you know, the absorptive, since we're talking about kind of recombination and also talking about some sense the origins of some of these seminal pieces in strategy, right? So one of the things that I think several people, let's use your president's terms, many people have said that, you know, there's a period which the absorptive capacity piece comes right in the middle of, from let's say the mid to early 80s to the mid to late 90s, where just so much foundational canonical work of what we call the strategy field today is happening, right? Whether it's evolutionary economics, it's RBV, it's absorptive capacity, it's myopia and search, it's adaptation in rugged landscapes, it's dynamic capabilities, all of that. And so as someone who's kind of a central figure in that sort of time period, what's going on there? What's in the air or the water that's kind of making?
I don't know whether I have a particular, I mean, I guess I have multiple thoughts, divergence of thoughts. So one is, I think what is big is perhaps more salient in retrospect than in real time. So how much of this in real time do people think is a big deal versus here's another paper that maybe 6 years down the road, oh yeah, this is like now influential. And so, into 2020, what's coming out in 2020 that maybe 6 years from now we'll view as kind of important. I think, there is something maybe more specific about, historically centered around the field. Well, I don't think it's a statement about necessarily why we won't get wonderful stuff today, but yeah, so maybe it's not not an explanation, but a fact. So, I've never taken a strategy course in my life. When I was a PhD student, Stanford blew up their strategy group. So they had a pretty distinguished, objectively distinguished group, Bourgeois, Jameson, Bergelman, and Bergelman became the sole survivor. And, Stanford, we should do something more disciplinary. And they kind of did some experimentation with that, and they're still, in some sense, experimenting. There might have been, there was some openness to outsiders, but I'm not sure, I'm not, but I guess what I'd also want to say or, point out, take Connie Health out as a, contemporary line in the, we didn't know each other at PhD, so, but, roughly. Okay. So, Connie's at Yale, Rick Levin. So, we didn't, grow up as in a strategy PhD program. But I don't, and I'm speaking on behalf of Connie, but I think I can safely say this. I don't think either of us think of ourselves as disciplinary kind of, Stalinists or something like, oh, we got trained in economics and sociology. We came to teach these, people the proper truth. In fact, no, I lose my job at Carnegie because I wasn't a proper member of, a certain church. So I think you have some people with diverse training, but intellectual openness. And versus like, my paradigm has the answer and we can be imperialistic, which we certainly see exemplars of. I'm not sure how helpful that is to the field or broader progress. But if we want to think about Schumpeterian recombinations, people who have some fairly deep intellectual diversity and a sort of open-mindedness might be interesting fodder for processes. Now, I think, what attracted me to the strategy field, and again, I suspect for Connie as well, it is sort of this wonderful, big, intellectually eclectic sandbox, okay, where again, it solved my identity problem. Was I a communist? Was I a OB person? Not really. Oh, here's a third option. Whoa, phew. I can do rational choice models with Brian Wu. That's okay. I can do learning models. It's all good. Like, wow. And, yeah, we get paid and you can be engaged with the MBA students. Like, wow, what a great gig. So I think it became for me, actually, yeah, kind of this kind of safe place, kind of intellectual eclecticism. And so I think that's partly, whether it's, and I babble and integrate, whether it's me as a journal editor or me as a department chair, why, yeah, I can be a hard-ass intellectual snob, but it's not about purity, okay? Like if I wanted to play the pure game, I would have stayed in one of these churches. And I get very nervous and hostile when sort of there's that kind of, we need to be disciplinary. Like, no, that's why I became a strategy person. I want interesting, complicated problems and some intellectual eclecticism. And I think that's kind of, so I think, whether some of us as outsiders, came in with a certain background, but also a kind of sensibility, and not the imperialism. So I think strategy field is great. We have great PhD students. We can nurture our own, really strong scholars, and have that kind of eclecticism. So yeah, I'm not sure it particularly answers your question, but you triggered yet another monologue.
That's mostly my goal, right?
Okay, you're good. It doesn't take much with me.
It's like an NK model, right? I just kind of take one step in the direction and then let you climb to the local peak. But I'm also curious about sort of building down that road. We've been talking about sort of absorptive capacity in this kind of tremendously successful paper. But obviously it's important to think about, I don't think anything you've written qualifies as a failure, but what would be, some ideas or things you worked on that you feel like you were surprised did not maybe get as much attention or did not get as much pickup as you would have thought they would be more impactful? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, actually, I think a relatively recent paper with Allison and Marino, I think is actually kind of interesting and important that nobody's paying attention to. It's important to my own thinking. But maybe we didn't make it compelling enough, I think. But the sort of the internal ecology, I think we actually had something kind of interesting to say. But, I ultimately, whether it's an individual or, I think about an individual article where people like, oh, we can blame the reviewers or blame the reviewers. Look, ultimately, it doesn't mean the author to make it compelling, make the sell. So, I'm not going to blame the audience. I didn't make the sell effectively, and maybe there were too many moving parts to get around. But I'm mostly mostly self-critical in the sense of like, okay, there's, I'm slow, moderately competent. There's lots of stuff I haven't done. So it's more my feebleness and on the production side than kind of, oh, here was this chestnut that, But again, as I take it, like, okay, maybe there'll be a down the road variant of that work that kind of like that clicks. And it's interesting. I rambling, but there's what's read as actually whether this is maybe politically incorrect or not in the kind of context, but historian talking about Columbus and like, why do we reify this guy? Okay, so clearly not the first, right? We got people coming from Asia a long time. They got him beat by a couple thousand years. So, and if we just cared about white guys, like, okay, you got the Nordic explorer. So like, he's not even the first white guy. Like, okay, so what makes it such a big deal? And he had a really interesting observation. And I've kind of used it a lot talking to junior scholars about work and like, oh, there was this piece and the antecedents and so on. And what I thought was really powerful is obviously like, after Columbus, he's important because he's the last one to discover. It didn't need to get rediscovered on that. Like, even white Europeans now knew where to find it, okay? So this is the last time we have to solve this problem. And I think, in academic work, there's always, we're building on. I mean, there were antecedents, obviously, of absorbing capacity. We cite them. We were like, bury them. David Teese's early work had some elements when he was thinking about multi-down investment. Nate Rosenberg was actually, I knew him, a friend of my parents, and he's some of his work. And I gave him this story to Nate, and he actually kind of liked it because he, yes, we cited Nate's work. We weren't hiding the stuff that he and Dave Maurer were doing. We were being as intellectually honest as we could in our intro. But there's sort of the work gets crystallized in a way, and the pieces come together and understood, and then that work becomes a touchstone and kind of encapsulates, a broader lineage and tradition of which it itself came out of, right? Nothing comes out of the blue. And so maybe trying to get back, like, down the day, will I do a kind of better version of that paper that kind of like crystallizes it and makes a better cell and has a stronger, yeah, maybe, but that's why I sort of feel like it's on me as the author creator. I didn't quite deliver, or maybe somebody else will be the Columbus who discovers the core of those ideas, and it won't be me because I didn't quite pull it together in a sufficiently effective way.
So shifting gears a little bit to think about, I mean, obviously you've played many editorial roles over the years, but I want to focus specifically on, right? So, you're editor-in-chief for organization science. You step down from that. Most people would take a break. You go ahead and like not only found a new journal, you found a whole new chapter of Informs. What drove that?
Yeah, well, kind of foolish, right? So, and I was actually for a little bit about it, I was also department chair, but so I mean, part of it, I'd renewed at Org Science, and that's really important to me, and felt good about what we were doing there. There began to be some chatter about maybe an informed strategy journal, and as you noted, like back in the day, I'd been a department editor within management science. And it struck me, maybe not sensible, rational, holistic sense about my life and allocating time and energy, but in terms of my editorial life, conditioned on spending a lot of time on editorial work, it seemed to me, actually, you know what, Org Science is in a good place. This could be a higher value contribution to the field. I mean, the field has had, one pure play journal. We're a pretty big field. One's a small number, better than zero. And certainly strategy work, there is a window within management science. A few pieces show up there, certainly Org Science. But I also was cognizant, I didn't want to, when I was doing Org Science, I was very cognizant of sort of not corrupting it and turning it into a strategy journal. Like, okay, I was aware, I'm a sort of, there's ways in which I felt like I both made sense and didn't make sense as editor-in-chief. I mean, Org Science had kind of a bit of a strong Carnegie lineage, started with Ari Lewin and Linda Argotti, and I sort of fit that piece, but they were more pure play org people than I was, and I was sort of self-conscious of like, okay, how much of that waterfront we should cover, and do I look like a evil strategy person corrupting Org Science as a journal, and I don't do that, and yet, and informed, there was a real logic, and so I could kind of, I had the relationship with the Informs folks to kind of had some credibility with them. And yeah, so instead of, filling out the next year or two of my Org Science term, what, if I'm going to spend this much of my whole life, that fraction of my life that I spent on editorial work, now maybe I could have reallocated that to other things, but conditional on that, a better use was kind of to start up strategy science. And so, the field could actually have two journals in a kind of elite high-end way that are pure play journals.
I mean, so we're not actually opening the questions yet, but I'm going to take one anyway because Gwen had a question, somewhat leading question, Gwen, but anyway, about how do you think strategy science is going?
This insider.
How much did you pay her to ask that question? Okay.
I think it's going well. I mean, I've really been pleased with, I'm proud of what we've been putting out. And we have the luxury as a quarterly, looking for 4 good articles. We get 4 good articles. And I feel like, part of what I want to do with it, and I think we are doing a little bit, is it's fun operating a boutique. So work science, like here's the Chandlerian firm, like, oh my God, you know, I'm dealing with exceptions and crises. And also sort of, it's sort of like being department chair, but better because you're a dictator, like department chair with this whole democracy thing, got to vote. So I'm kind of, I like benign dictatorships is my kind of preferred mode of governance. But it's this giant thing, and I'm not touching manuscripts in an intellectual sense, right? And like, oh my God, I can actually like read papers, and my senior editors can like, Bill Burnett and Joanne Oxley can actually read and think about a manuscript. They're not, you know, you folks are doing AMJ and SMJ, whew, bless your heart, you're moving a lot of product. That's a lot of volume. And you're working really hard, but we all have finite time and energy. So it's a real pleasure to, without completely driving myself crazy, and I think and we have a pretty senior editor team, you know, to kind of get a little, you know, we're tough, a lot of immediate rejects, but if we're dealing with the manuscript, can actually engage with it. And I think partly because the editors are particularly on the senior side, you know, all work is imperfect in its own way, and you got to make trade-offs and choices. And I think both we have norms and a team that can do that. You know, this is interesting. It pushes the ball forward. There's some real value here, and you know, we can also, here's the, I mean, you'll go back to the reviewers. You know, Joanne can take it the next mile. So it's kind of there's a gratification of both kind of adding something to the field. There's also kind of intellectual gratification at a kind of narrow level that, you know, dealing with something that had a large end manuscripts, you know, I wasn't able to do. But I also hope, and looking forward to be part of that as a byproduct, to open up the iron cage of genres, right? So you know, the example of Victor Benn and Emily Feldman, you know, this kind of paper that's really well done empirics without any hypothesis. Like, here it is. You know, we see these kind of investments, what's going on, what's triggering the acquisitions, and I've been able to use that as an editor. Like, actually, I gave somebody a yes reject and said, like, you know, you got these. I'm not buying your kind of strained theoretical argument. There's an interesting phenomenon here. You got some interesting data. Somebody's like, why are we pretending here? I'm just saying, could you? It actually took them a while back before I convinced them, and it was great. They like threw away this turgid, painful front end. It's readable. It's interesting. There's something there, and you know, and so both at the individual manuscript, but also like, you know, that's a way to have an article. And so I think more generally, and I think as we can open up the sort of genres, you know, there's some positive indigeneity. Somebody sees that, oh, I can write an article that's in a somewhat different format, you know, or I can write this. Actually, the very first paper we published, Luz Cabral, I love it as an exemplar of genre, because he kind of did it in the John Sutton style, where like, here's this game theory model, and in the back end, I basically got some case examples, kind of like Sutton does in his book. Like, any reasonable normal journal, you'd send it out, and the empirists would like, you know, one of the reviewers is the IO empirist, like, what the hell, really? You know, you got these 3 arbitrary industries, and you're showing me some descriptives on them, like, really? You know, you expect the elite journal to do this? And I think, like, whoa, that makes your game theory model so much more interesting. Like, I actually now, you anchored it in some phenomena, but, you know, it takes a established senior editor acting in manuscript says, yeah, this is weird and unusual picture, but in a good way. And wouldn't it be awesome if other people thought to do that? You know, that you know, you've got your model. Can I reduce it, or can I find a data set that really allows me to test it in a kind of mean conventional sense? But, you know, better than the sort of just Wall Street Journal little example. These kind of, you know, and actually I would hold up Sutton as a wonderful exemplar to PhD students. You know, kind of like just, wow, you know, from a aesthetic point of view and analytical, these beautiful models, and then here's a chapter about the butter industry. Like, how cool is that? So, you know, that's a different genre. You know, what Miles Shaver likes to call the just the facts paper. You know, that's a different genre. So I think we can both we're happy to have conventional stuff, and we can make our own kind of trade-offs and help curate that kind of stuff. But I think we're, as a smaller volume boutique, able to kind of push the frontiers a little bit on the genre side, which, you know, if I'm handling 40 manuscripts a year, no, I'm not doing that. I mean, it's just, you know, it's impossible. As earnest as anybody, you know, I'm sure you are. It's just like we're all bounded. So I think that's yeah, kind of fun, a way it can kind of broaden the field in interesting ways, and it's nice. Yeah. So yeah, I'm feeling good.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually pass it over to Andrea, because I know he had you know, we were going to sort of switch back and forth, and I've been taking up all the air. So Andrea, all yours.
Okay, so well, one of the classic questions that we ask at these sessions is what do you think are some of the most sort of some of the research questions that are more interesting and also maybe important in strategy at this point in time?
At some level, I have no clue. I mean, you guys, I mean, I'm pretty self-absorbed. I know, you know, what hates me, and maybe self-absorbed enough. Like, if I find it interesting, and with 2 or 3 people I talk to, it's kind of, you know, seems like a fun project. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I kind of have, you know, for the field. I mean, I could tell you from my narrow self-absorbed perspective.
Yeah, no, from your perspective, absolutely.
You know, so and again, in my narrow little sandbox in which I operate. So thinking about, you know, issues of learning adaptation. You know, one thing, so again, I would offer two. One sort of maybe slightly narrower, one more I've done some work on, one less. So learning and strategy as ideas, in some ways, are kind of not natural bedfellows, right? In the sense of, you know, one way we think about something as being strategic is, oh, it has long-term intertemporal implications, or, oh, it's deal with the entire firm, it's got these spatial interdependencies. And think about my ancient work with Jim March and the Myopia of Learning, that's exactly where learning would break down, okay? And so for all like the current enthusiasm, oh, machine learning is going to substitute for strategic thinking. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's going to be really awesome about how I ought to price my goods on Amazon, maybe, and what font colors I should use on my website. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be unambiguously really awesome at kind of the operational level. But slow, unclear feedback situations is where, so it's always been a kind of challenge, puzzle for me. I'm a learning guy, it's reinforcement, and I happen to think about reinforcement learning in its exactly worst context, strategy. So that's an interesting challenge, and that's why, you know, some of the early stuff I did with, you know, Christine and Yurker on credit assignment, it's what made me interested in analogical reasoning. Oh, there'd be that, you know, so, you know, doing some current work on generalization, but it's still, yeah, you think about the credit assignment, so in some sense, it's your mental model becomes the reinforcement. And that was sort of Holland's got a very interesting kind of idea. So I still think I am fairly feeble in the ways in which I've sort of thought about and understand that. I still am sort of intellectually committed to both agendas, learning and strategy. So that's a problem. And so I've done work, but I think there's a lot to be done there. I think another, or maybe done even less, is power and politics. So yeah, we have a cartoon version of power and agency model. Here I am. I get to set the structure on this godlike principle, and you know, I don't completely control you. I have contingent contracts, but the kind of contestation, right? And then we have like the learning people. Okay, people are a little confused. Life is complicated, but they're earnest souls. And in some ways, politics is a little bit in between. It's not quite the agency model. There's some sense of individual subgroup interest. And, you know, certainly, you know, some of that has entered the field, but I still think you know, it's sort of on my to-do list. I have a couple projects I'm finishing up, and actually something I'd actually like to, and maybe even combine a little bit those two kind of interests, and around thinking about coalitions inside the organizations. And so, yeah, I think it's been not really part of, and I think you know, I think about organizations as these nested hierarchical subsystems. And so, and you think about resource allocation, then clearly the politics should be part of that. And it's not independent of thinking about ideas about credit assignment and why different groups and coalitions with the enterprise may have more or less power. So you can imagine combining those agendas. So that's my very narrow little world that I live in. You know, more broadly, I mean, it is interesting for me, or you know, or the you know, you always sometimes, you know, my state, am I a dinosaur or is the world coming around to your point of view? So I think kind of both. It's really fascinating, right? And like, you know, Andre, our work on thinking about lean startup. So this idea of the experiment organization is like front and center, right? This is no longer, so it's being very much part of kind of how business practice is operating. I think, well, I'm gonna probably get in trouble when this is recorded. I think you know, the sort of random controlled trial variant, which is kind of, I think, you know, well, I'll back. I mean, I have something I'm in the process of writing, and I will hold off for more coherent kind of triangulation between RCT and other perspectives on learning. Yeah, so yeah, partly relevant, partly dinosaur. But yeah, okay, so those are some of my own, those are my personal kind of to-do items, you know, if I don't get seduced by other things in the future.
Thank you. So that was very, very interesting. One more question that we had is about, so we have lots of PhD students in the junior faculty in this session. And so, you know, the world of business school has been changing a lot over the past few years, you know, online education, there's a little bit of a sort of a shift of, you know, tech companies, jobs, and things like that. And then this recent pandemic has maybe made this change even more intense and faster. So lots of us are trying to kind of navigate this kind of career at the beginning. And so do you have any piece of advice on how to read the situation?
Well, so, I mean, there's multiple elements there. So kind of, are there some systemic forces that are somewhat adverse from the point of view of somebody with a PhD or about to get a PhD in business strategy? Yeah, I think, I'm not sure what one does about it, but I would say, you know, the MBA market is going to shrink, right? So now, fortunately, I think still the good state schools still have a large undergraduate business program, and there will be jobs for people who teach business strategy. If I was running an MBA program at one of those institutions, this is probably a time of real stress, but that doesn't, you know, at those institutions, the bulk of the teaching is actually always at the undergraduate level. So I think at the MBA world, I certainly want, you know, being a dean at certain institutions would be a point of stress. I'm not sure how it will affect faculty on the margin. Are we slightly less resource rich, and your research accounts on the margin may go down a little bit because of the MBA program? Or is this accelerating a change that was happening anyway, And instead of having a sort of a money-losing, small, under-scale MBA program, we operate at scale at the undergraduate level. And in fact, our bottom line, hasn't changed. But that in some ways is a dean's problem, not the professor's problem. I think there are ways in which arguably systemic macro changes are to the good. And this speaks a little bit about the experimental organization, right? So arguably, the 80s, 90s, Jim March used to joke about business schools basically being schools of applied economics. I think that is perhaps going to become less true, okay? The interest in entrepreneurship, the recognition of kind of I think the financial collapse, even Wharton, which has a kind of strong tradition, finance, or Columbia, the financial collapse, the Great Recession was a bit of a wake-up call. Oh, consulting, jobs in actually operating companies, jobs in tech companies, that's actually kind of important for our students. We're not, and so I think in ways that sort of are helpful for our team, as it were, the relevant imports within the context of the MBA education or the undergraduate education of management and strategy, I think is there's a relative ascendancy of that versus 10, 15 years ago of finance. I'm coming in, I'm learning some finance, I'm learning some tricks, and then I'm going to go off to the investment bank or hedge fund, kind of walking out the door and working at Google or Amazon in corporate development, where yes, I know some finance, but I also actually know something about strategy, is becoming a more typical career path, and then the sort of the intellectual challenge that one can have, and sort of now we're in this world of big data. So back in the day, the big data that unless you were in consumer marketing, big data meant data about asset pricing. So I was going to be this analytical person and show my analytical cleverness on econometrics. Let me backcast my new model of asset pricing. Okay. Whoa, now we got big data on operating stuff. I can think about big data or medium-sized data in these other contexts. So I think some of the sort of trainable skills out of the business school, our comparative advantage, the arenas in which that can be manifest have grown, and particularly grown outside the world of finance. So in some, I think there is a kind of shrinkage. Yeah, but I hope that's just going to take small MBA programs maybe to smaller, but doesn't fundamentally change our profession. And I think there are ways in which of growth, certainly, I suspect you look at most distributions, you look at the institutions, the distribution of student majors and so on have kind of shifted in the last 10 years in ways that are sort of favorable for the folks on this call. You're muted.
I just said thank you. It was great. And I'll pass it back to Wasim now.
So Dan, since we were just hearing from one of your PhD students, I figure this is a good time to ask you the question about PhD students. So as I mentioned, you've really been kind of central to PhD education at Wharton, working with, I think I may be one of the few people you didn't actually work with, through some combination of myopia on my part and foresight on yours. So actually we had a couple of questions that people had asked me to ask. So I'm just going to ask those together. And the questions were really about sort of selection effects or treatment effects, right? So, so what do you look for when picking PhD students to work with, and then what advice do you give them that turns them into these sort of incredible researchers?
So I'm going to give the answer that Jim March used to give, which is like, I don't pick students, they pick me. You didn't pick me a scene. People come to my office. Andrea came to my office, talked to me. That was a little, maybe less friendly the initial conversation. I warmed up. Actually, Sendel has this great story. When I got this, I got the award from the Academy for doctoral training, apparently not apocryphal. So when he was a student, there was some rumor that I gave them a math test. And so Sendel tells a story like, you know, I've been taking math for a while, I don't know. I'm kind of interested in talking about Dan on modularity. And he bravely came in and it turned out it wasn't a math test. Now, I remember our first couple conversations where I said like, no, I don't like your idea. I liked him. And, you know, the third conversation became the basis of our management science paper. So, yeah, my door's open. Some people walk in, some don't. I think maybe why some people don't walk in and what I don't, I'm not, you know, I'm interested in an open conversation. I'm not interested. Someone said, you know, I think we could get a publication doing X. Like, oh my God, that's like total relationship turnoff. It's like, oh, where's the magic? You're being way too instrumental here. So yeah, maybe I'm more inviting to conversations or something, but it's, I think it's, yeah, it's a selected in. Now, I guess part of treatment, you know, maybe per that, I'm sort of sharing, you know, what do I know? I can only learn from what my students tell me, former students. So Ron Adler is another kind of great story about the ways I'm worthless or maybe useful. So he's a PhD student and his peers, apparently, you know, he's hearing from his peers all this great stuff about what they should be doing in the academy and networking more broadly and thinking about this stuff. And he's feeling like, oh my God, like, what the hell? I'm with Dan and I'm not getting any of this good stuff. So he comes in like, so Dan, you know, I'm hearing all this stuff. Like, so when are you gonna give me these good chestnuts about tactics? And I looked at him like, you know, Ron, let's just do good work. Okay, that's hard. You know, I mean, it's like, how much bandwidth do you want to like spend, you know, thinking about being clever in those ways? And Ron has this great thing, like, it was both absolutely useless advice and some of the best advice. So I think what I try, I mean, there's a sort of, you know, there's, March would say, you know, there's the process. So I think the sort of passion for the work, the sort of, and that you're really, yes, ultimately you want some publications, but is there that excitement? There's something that's animating you, and that's going to make it both more fun and ultimately better work. You know, kind of, I think sometimes, you know, I think one way is what you can contribute. We have this sort of, you know, who's going to be the little boy who says the emperor has no clothes, right? It's kind of like willing to challenge, taken for granted assumptions, being, you know, I tend to be irreverent in ways that maybe not work for me. Maybe in some cases it works and kind of socialize that. But I think, and I think it's just students, yeah, you know, somebody wants a structured pathway, like I'm going to be frustrating because like, I'm going to ask you what you're interested in and but Dan, you're supposed to tell me what I'm supposed to do. So I think there's an issue of fit, but that's really driven more by the student and yeah, I'm sort of question driven, you know, it works for some, and I'm, you know, I think part of the blessing at Board is to have, you know, have a great, we have good input as well.
I think in my case, it was mostly just the beard, but, you know, so if you shaved it off a little bit earlier, we could have had you together. Anyway, so, you know, we are getting to the point where I want to move to Q&A, but I have one last question before I do that. So looking back, you know, from the vantage point of where you sit in your career now and keeping in mind that we have many PhD students, assistant professors on the call and potentially viewing this video, what would be the one thing you know now or appreciate now that you wish you had known then or appreciated when you were just starting out?
I don't know, I was pretty foolish and non-instrumental. So like, and that, you know, I sort of blundered in my Mr. Magoo way and it sort of worked out for me. I was kind of partly so norms have changed. I was sort of my personal inclination and maybe socialized. Like shy. I would never go to somebody and like, oh, here's this paper, or, you know, reach out to somebody at the academy. Like, it would never like, okay, you know, people I had existing ties with or the meeting. So I probably was more insular than, you know, life would have been more fun, probably other kind of ideas. I think partly, you know, I think there's individual differences and also kind of historical time period effects. But if you're thinking out, like, I'm not sure. So I think, you know, we like talking shop. I like talking. That's what I do. You know, yes, I'm busy. If you send me a paper, people on this call, no, I'm not going to probably read it. But you know, you catch me at the right moment somewhere, and I'm happy to chat for a half hour about what's going on because of the randomness of it. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I was probably sort of more reserved in some ways, and might have been fun or useful.
Okay, so I want to move on to Q&A, but before we do that, I want us to take a screenshot. This is the point where you no longer get to hide behind your little black screens. As Samina likes to say, if you're decent from the waist up, or appropriately dressed, whatever the hell that means, from the waist up, you know, it would be great if you could share your video so we can kind of take a picture. I'm gonna give you like 10 seconds to think about that decision and make that choice and weigh the pros and cons in some hyper rational way if you want to, although this is Dan's session, so probably you shouldn't weigh the hyper rationally, you should just take a chance. And then we'll take a picture, and then I'm guessing, Andrea, hopefully you will take a picture, although I guess I can too. Okay, so I'm gonna count down to, so 3, 2, 1, smile. There we go. Okay. So let's open it up to questions. I know we had a number of questions in the chat. And so I'm just gonna call on you, and you can unmute yourself if assuming you're still here. I'm gonna just call on you and ask you to ask your question rather than trying to read it out, trying to interpret what you were saying and put it through the sort of 6 degrees problem. So Ali, you had a question about demand for modeling complexity. If you're here and you want to ask that.
Yes, hello, thank you, Dan, for this very interesting discussion and sharing your ideas. This question is related to the point you made earlier about the ideas you sent to the journal and got published. My question is about whether you see there is the increase for modeling or statistical complexities is affecting the quality of the ideas being published. Thank you.
I'm not sure or what the counterfactual you kind of have in mind of sort of, I'm not sure they're substitutes. I'm not going to claim that, you know, Carl White could write some rather brilliant conceptual work that didn't have any model, and his empirics didn't have any fancy econometrics. Carl's a pretty clever guy. The work had real impact. So I don't think the fancy econometrics or the fancy modeling is a substitute for some underlying core interesting question. You know, I don't think is it a necessary or carrier. You know, it's probably hard to get a paper that's just verbal theory. You know, the sort of early J. Barney type papers would probably be hard to publish in 2020. And would you need sort of the basic core J insight and some, you know, see Rich there, you know, got some model, you know, kind of substantiating that, you know, maybe in 2020. But I do think it's a mistake to, again, think, because there's this technical sophistication, oh, the ideas must be rich. Like, no, they're kind of somewhat independent. So, you know, do you want to be at the frontier of clarity and whether empirical or theoretical, what you're doing? Yeah. But you know, at the end, there's some animating idea. And actually, I think, say, working with doctoral students, some where I want to see like the 2 or 3 paragraph statement of what you're up to, because there's no way to hide. Like the longer thing, blah, 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 and here's the literature, blah, 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 and I'm reading it, my eyes are glazing, and I'm sort of getting it, there's a lot of moving parts. But the page version, like, whoa, there it is. There's something there, or there's not something there. And so, yeah. So I'm not sure if it's a good answer to your question, but I view them as kind of independent attributes.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And since we, Bakan, I know you had a question, but before that, since we are talking about doctoral students again, Georgina, you had a question about doctoral students. Do you want to just ask that?
Oh, hi. Thank you for the organization sharing. I'm a year 1 PhD student from HKUST. So I was wondering what kind of advices you would like to give for doctoral students specific for them choosing their dissertation topics and research identity. And what's the common mistake you see during this process they made?
Yeah, that's a tough life point, right? Kind of, it's very daunting. And now, to some degree, people in the modern age have kind of made that less daunting in the 3 essay dissertation. Like, oh, here's my 2nd year paper, and now I do another paper, and then we aggregate it, and it looks like a dissertation. That's less daunting. The potential pathology there is, will you ever have the killer app job talk that's going to blow people away? Right? That's kind of, you know, do I have that really ambitious thing? So it's one of it. But how does that, you know, I think you need to give yourself time, okay? And that's a little bit scary. So ideally, like, okay, I'm working on this, you know, maybe I'm the RA or my 2nd year paper, and it's an okay project and it's keeping me kind of busy. But I'm giving myself a couple hours in the afternoon to think about this more ambitious idea. But there's only so many hours in the day I can think productively about ambitious idea, right? You know, when I'm not concretely building my data set, doing something, you know, kind of tangible. But I think doing any piece of work is an enormous amount of time. Okay, there's no easy papers. So I think one of the unsettling things as a doctoral student is, am I going to give myself a couple of months of hanging, you know, before I really feel like there's an idea, or I have this idea, and this is a context where I think, you know, I can make this happen. And you know, I think the advisor has to try to make that comfortable. And again, if that's the only thing you're doing, then you kind of are being a little bit unproductive, and you're going to feel even more anxious and bad about yourself. I think some level of parallelism of kind of, there's the, you know, initial early stage thing I'm doing, and, you know, here's this more ambitious thing that's kind of maybe not so well defined conceptually yet. Maybe I got it defined conceptually, but I haven't found, you know, the right data context. I mean, I'm gonna, you know, it's dangerous being one of my former students, because even though you grew up and you're this distinguished in your people, that I could still tell stories about when you were a youngster. So in this context, my story would be, say, Felipe Cesar, you know, he had this beautiful, lovely model. But to find empirical context, okay, he needed to see, you know, errors of both of type 1 and type 2. He had to see things that were rejected and were they good or not bad ideas. Oh my God, that's like impossible at scale. So Felipe would come in office, we'd brainstorm, and then come in like 3 weeks later, we'd brainstorm. And Felipe's got a lot of energy, a lot of positive, as many of you know him well. it was kind of tough, you know, when you're month 2 or so of that process, right? And then he had this brilliant idea about mutual funds and how he could do it. But, you know, it wasn't, I'm sure, a happy, and he was, you know, he had some other papers and he could do the model. And then it was an enormous amount of work to do once he had the, oh my God, this context could work for me. That still was an enormous heavy lift empirically. But that's like work, okay? You know, I know the gradient, I've defined it, okay? I can climb this hill, it's, you know, there's some tricks and there's some different things about, non-trivial things about finance and asset pricing I need to learn, but it's a well-defined agenda. You know, the hardest, scariest part is I have a diffuse meta concept, you know, I haven't narrowed it down enough conceptually, or I haven't thought about a context where I can map these ideas and get empirical traction. And I guess so, I don't know, you know, a magic, you know, how you search through that process, but it is worth giving yourself time to do that. It's the point in your career where you have the most time. I mean, you know, do I come out at year 5 or 6 has life consequences for you? You need to eat in year 6, and your stipend may have disappeared. So I don't, you know, that's real. But in another level, you're not on the tenure clock. Well, you are the tenure clock. You know, there are other jobs. Like, okay, you know, I didn't get tenure at Carnegie. So, you know, it may take a little bit of time to kind of gel, because if you rush that, you're going to work really hard, and it's in the plateau of the work. You know, you give your seminar, the job talk, and people are going to beat you up like at the opening sentence because it didn't actually have like the right design, you know, and so, and you still spend a year of your life building that data set and doing that. So if you think about, you know, I'm not, as Asim was alluding to, Mr. Rational Expectations, but, you know, you can think a little bit ahead, okay? What will be the critiques of this work? Before I spend 8 months of my life building the data set and doing this, okay? You should be able to think pretty crisply at the design stage of, it's gonna be limited, but do I feel like I'm gonna be a pretty good position when I walk into that seminar and give my job talk? You know, I feel, you know, but think about those critiques, anticipate those critiques before you make the massive investment. And maybe the answer is, you know what, this isn't quite the expression of the conceptual ideas. This isn't quite the empirical context. Let me spend a few more afternoons. And again, hopefully, you know, with your advisor, you've got some other work where you can kind of spend the mornings, or I don't, you might maybe switch your time of day, but it's been part of my day. You know, it's the exploitation. You know, I'm not just waiting for lightning to strike, but I'm also not prematurely locking in, because I think in many cases, when people are getting critiquing the job talk, these were foreseeable problems. You know, you may not get the empirical, oh, I wish I get greater statistical significance or something. Okay, fine. But that's not why people are getting beat up in their job talk. Okay, they're getting beat up typically because of some fundamental properties about the research design. And so that's something ex ante you can attend to, and maybe again, you give yourself the emotional comfort of, I'm going to toy with some other things. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to wait for the perfect thing. I mean, again, I am embarrassing senior scholars in the field. In his youth, Michael Jacobitis, and this probably won't surprise people know Michael, but he would come in with literally, I remember him coming with 6 fully formed, individually interesting, complex, you know, dissertation proto-proposal. I'm like, which one should I pick? And my answer was, close your eyes and pick one randomly. Stop having this conversation. Let's just move on with our life. I mean, so he had the opposite of like this, plethora of things, and which one was going to win the Nobel Prize, and we had to parse that. That's unusual. That's Michael. Michael's unusual. He's got a lot of incubating lots of ideas in wonderful ways. But so you could have that pathology, among these amazing things, and then it's just like close your eyes and go. Okay. But more typical is it's almost there. It's not quite there, or think harder about the context, think a little more crystally maybe on the conceptual side about exactly what I'm doing. Because what often happens, you see in the review process, and it's, how one produces mediocre work at some level is like, I thought I was going down this path, other reviewers reading this issue, I'll repackage it. I mean, in some ways that can actually work. Okay, oh, this really is what was going on, and now I have this deeper truth. But it's, it's kind of, my stronger papers, like, okay, I ended up, it wasn't like I knew exactly what was going to happen at the back end, but it's a pretty damn clear idea before I sat down to work on it. I don't like, oh, let's just go involve this joint mutual discovery process and see what we happen. No, I'm happy to have open-ended conversations about, oh, so how does reinforcement look? What does generalization look like? Okay, and this is where I am probably frustrating to doctoral students and why many sensible ones would want to work with me, because I'll have those conversations for a few months. And until I have a clear, oh, this is something well-defined that I can imagine doing. Now let's do something. But I'm not about to commit to real work as opposed to the afternoon wide-eyed speculation until there's real clarity. And again, I don't think most of the problems, I don't think should have been ex post surprises. You can have ex post disappointments on the particular nature of the empirical results or something. And I'm sometimes surprised about the model, maybe intuition. But the kind of first order stuff where people get beat up, actually I think it's mostly could have been anticipated, and give yourself time to think through that. So that's sort of maybe a negative, but I think it's important to kind of entertain that to get to the really powerful piece that you're going to feel good about, that you'll be able to defend effectively in that job talk situation.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna, since we are talking about ideas, I'm gonna open it up to Burke. You wanna ask your question about ideas?
Yeah, sure. My question is actually pretty simple. I was curious about, to learn which idea of Dan is he most proud of, given that he has worked with so many different projects and so many different, he has uncovered so many different insights. Is there one that when he still looks back and says, wow, that was a good idea?
Right. So what version of response I feel like, the parent of multiple children, you're supposed to love all your children. And so there's some hesitation about, kind of, the favorite child kind of mythology. So, I think I would give maybe an obvious and a less obvious answer. So the sort of obvious, perhaps, in terms of changing the conversation in a kind of clean, definitive way. Absorb capacity, right, has that. It was generative and generative lots of levels. So that's, certainly feel proud of being associated with that. In some aesthetic sense, this is actually aesthetics matter to me. A kind of sleeper, most of you probably wouldn't know, but it's population ecology people like it. I love my paper on random walks as a kind of just as a thing of beauty. Here's a incredibly simple stylized model, and thank you, Glenn Carroll, I was able to test it. So it was kind of a rare case of a kind of simple, clean analytical model. You don't get simpler than a random walk process. It's kind of generative though about what it says about kind of organizational life chances. And actually I was able to kind of link it to empiric. So sort of from a kind of a, outdoor capacity had that as well, but actually in some ways we had pretty good measures. But it's sort of, there's a certain, it's more stylized, but it has a certain beauty. But I have a funny Wharton story on that one too. But that's the first paper I gave as a Wharton faculty member. I'm like, okay, I went from this, well, Carnegie, kind of interesting, wacky, disciplinary place. Now I'm in this proper business school, and I give this paper a random walk. And Ned Bowman was this wonderful, wonderful man. It was really kind of a cornerstone of the Imagine Department and the emergence of the kind of modern strategy group. And Ned, old school, taking a lunch. And so after he kind of walks me out to lunch, and he's a kind of a traditional scholar in a certain way. And Ned kind of says, so Dan, you don't really think firms and management is random? No, I don't really think it. But it's a first approximation, Ned. It kind of sort of fits the data. But anyway, so those are two very, from a narrow, granular aesthetic sense, and a kind of maybe macro sense in some sense. But I think it's sort of among the things, little chestnuts or multiple chestnuts I kind of, picked up and kind of hold dear from Jim March. He would like to cite T.S. Eliot responding to a critic about the love song of J.F. Prufrock. And Eliot writes, like, basically, whoa, you critic? Like, I would have never thought and given a bad interpretation, but you know what? I'm grateful you read the poem and it meant something to you. And so, Jim would offer that up in the context of you do the work and then it's public domain, and kind of they have their own life and people construct meaning around it, or they construct no meaning, and it's but so, and maybe it's my own pathology, but I'm actually fairly emotionally detached from the work. And that's, I think, on ways, but it also, I can see weakness of it. I had a funny exchange, I rambled too much, but Najib Workowitz, a relatively recent PhD student. So we did this paper, and in that core of that exercise was my realization of the fundamental weakness in the NK enterprise, about how it thought it's like, it did not capture what Simon was talking about, nearly composed system. And it was so funny in the review process because the first two rounds, it's like, Leventhal has done this, he did on modularity, like, why are you being so outrageous and sacrilegious? Like, look, I like Leventhal in 97, I like the stuff he did with Edwards too, but you know what? In retrospect, I see a real problem here. And this work is actually addressing what I think is a really fundamental misunderstanding about what nearly decomposable system has not been captured by that line of work. And finally, on the third revision, Magic and I were able to convince them that there actually was a really basic weakness in this earlier work by Leventhal. And like, I like that work. I can also see like, whoa, you really kind of missed something. So, it's a beloved child, but it's like, our children are imperfect. We still love them. So, yeah. But I think that's also healthy if one is going to have a long, productive career. Not to get too enamored of the magic of any particular prior work, and like, it's limited. I could have done more on all that stuff, so whether I or somebody else does the more, that's great.
So I'm actually gonna, since we are talking about, I know there was a question in the chat from Hui-sun about like modeling, and do you want to just ask that question since we're talking about models?
Yeah, sure. So thanks a lot for sharing the experience and insights. I will just read the question. So the first question is, given the close connection between the organizational learning models we develop in our fields and the vast repertoire of reinforcement learning models in the artificial intelligence world, do you think the two fields could benefit from more conversations in the future? And if I may ask, like, in what direction do you think they will connect more?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting question, but it's also interesting, I think, to sort of put it in historical context. So in the beginning, you know, AI and organization theory and org learning, you know, have a kind of joint birth, as it were. Okay, so, you know, Ed Feigenbaum is contributing to the behavioral theory of the firm, and then becomes a kind of pioneer in computer science and knowledge-based engineering. So the sort of, you know, protocol analysis, the if-then rule, you know, that's sort of a touchstone of early AI. Now, you know, conceptually in the late 70s, but it wasn't until relatively recently with both bigger data and faster machines, you know, with the neural nets and sort of modern reinforcement learning. But you also have, you know, intermediate between those. And so, you know, as a PhD student, I was blessed in lots of ways. One of the ways I was blessed is Michael Cohen took a year sabbatical from Michigan, and Michael had been very involved with the efforts there, and John Holland, and the sort of little group built around Holland in Michigan, thinking about emergent systems. And, you know, first year PhD student made me, Dan, you should read Holland's work on adaptation of natural and artificial systems. And so, you know, I'm thinking about credit assignment in the 80s, right? So, and it's, you know, Holland is channeling earlier work by Samuels, you know, the first credit assignment model, Samuels, in 1959. So just to say, it wasn't, there was that early work, knowledge engineering takes over, then you kind of got the reinforcement neural net. So this is part of a longer arc, bigger conversation. Jim March did the exploitation model because Michael Cohen is waving Holland's book around, and that idea is core to Holland's book. So this is not a, you know, so there's some interesting particular things happening currently, but just want to say, you know, this interplay between AI and org learning, you know, actually, you know, it's starting at least in 1962. Okay, and it has this back and forth. Now, the credit assignment work, it actually didn't have much purchase in computer science already. You know, Holland did it. His genetic algorithm became a big hit. Nobody really paid much attention to credit assignment. You know, Yerker, Christy, and I tried to kind of bring it a little bit in the work field. So, you know, yes, there's particular interesting, exciting. It's becoming, you know, an important engine of applied engineering. It's becoming an important engine in operational managerial practices. So yes, the conversation will still go on. You know, some hour and 20 minutes ago, I noted, you know, the sort of paradox of my joint interest in strategy and learning, in the ways in which they both go together and don't go together, right? Like, ooh, strategy, that's a complex problem, never gonna get right. Ooh, learning's probably important. Oh, learning's reinforcement based. Where's reinforcement gonna be murkiest and lousiest? Oh, that's in a strategic context. So, yeah, there's exciting stuff. I think one of the things you need to ask, or one might ask oneself, is this as a tool of practice. This is a tool I, as a modeler, am using to think about and model organization, right? So actually, I had a PhD student that ran off and did something else, but I was trying to get him years ago in the early days, you know, thinking about credit assignment in a pretty serious ways, and, you know, the organization as this nested system. Harposen is starting to do some interesting work along the line. So one version is you sort of take some of this stuff, and I treat it as the social sciences, a model of the organization, and I get some insights around it. Clearly the other is, ooh, this is the self-tuning organization. This is really awesome, and it's using these kind of reinforcement processes. And both are really interesting. I do think, you know, having once written many years ago a paper on the myopia of learning, you know, I am back to what I was saying in terms of strategy, the challenge of strategy and reinforcement learning processes, that I'm not sure the myopia, you know. So again, think about it. Learning how to teach the car to drive itself is a very hard engineering problem. I don't want to diminish the hardness of that problem. Lots of clever people, magazines are spending a lot of time doing that. The basis of reinforcement are pretty damn clear. Did I hit another car? Did I hit a human being? Did I run into the lamppost? Okay, so the processing in real time of complex data is an incredibly hard engineering problem. And I do want some version of credit assignment of what are the early signals of I might be running in danger, maybe I want to slow down my speed, okay? But first of all, I can simulate that. I can run it on a test track. I can run it on a low density suburb outside Phoenix and not put too many people at risk. That's different than saying, you know, and again, a company, Google or Amazon, can do that at an operational level. And you're seeing those kind of interesting operational experiments, right? Let me play with our offerings. Let me play with how things are presented to different customers. And now we get a lot of data, and we're going to develop better insights around our marketing strategy, how we want to price, and all sorts of interesting things, important things. I think what's interesting is that that slowly moves up the food chain. So, oh, maybe we can do this about when we greenlight films, and we're getting more clever about early indicators and trading this stuff. And now we don't need to see a pilot because we can trade it based on some big vector. And very early game, we feel comfortable about trading this project. So I do think it's really interesting. I don't mean to, like to think of myself, I don't think I'm a dinosaur. I'm just thinking I'm sort of slightly contrarian. So I think it's interesting how it kind of moves up from tactical to little less strategic. Of, do I greenlight this TV series? Okay, that's not trivial. There's real money involved in that. But do I, as Amazon, enter the TV production, movie production business? I don't think that was done with reinforcement learning. And I'm not quite sure, and maybe, well, these will be dissertations for you guys, maybe, I'm not sure how that would happen. Okay, so that's what I mean. I think it's really, so I think part of it is exciting. It's like, how far up the food chain can it go? And I think as we get cleverer about analogical reasoning, I mean, this is my personal little agenda, on this. And on range, generalization, credit assignment, maybe we move up, and both, me as a kind of living in my little ivory tower, or practitioners, in different ways, kind of doing that. But I think it's also for the fundamental attributes of strategy, and it's in some of the fundamental problems of myopia of reinforcement learning. That's hard. But creating proto experience, but I think so. Again, I think it's an exciting moment because we are kind of pushing those frontiers, but I don't, because we have exciting stuff that happen in the world of big data, doesn't mean that same magic is going to happen in small data context. But we are in an interesting moment. That's sort of, the fun, in my view, is like, being the curmudgeon, when e-commerce came out and somebody called, oh, everything's changed. Like, yeah, when you move to a different part of the parameter space where the cost of information transmission becomes zero, yeah, things change. The fundamental theories of economics and physics, didn't change. So certainly the challenge of reinforcement learning are still there, but yes, kind of where we are in that parameter space, the kind of experiments we can create, the kind of feedback we can create. Yeah, that is different than 2020 than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And so the opportunity structure does change. But so yes, I think there's a long, rich, interesting history between AI. And it, in some ways it has, well, in the early days, it went from Herb Simon and some of those to AI. I'm not sure we're having much impact. Well, I think the extent that it's happening now, and I'm rambling too long, I think frankly the interplay has been more on as the issue of measurement. So we can do unsupervised learning and create some interesting variables in our empirical analysis, right? So that's AI. We can do topic modeling. So I think where the early frontier applications have been that, where it kind of enters, we can take richer data sets and different kind of data and do things with it and expand our kind of empirical footprint. You know, that's where you're sort of seeing the early papers. You know, whether at a metaphorical level as models of organization or what we know about organizations informing what scholars in the other community. I'm not so sure. But at a meta level, you know, it warms my heart that, you know, in economics, you know, you assume the world's simple enough so your optimization works. You know, the world's concave, so first order conditions apply. Don't bug me about non-concave worlds. And so it's great, you know, engineers have to do things. They can't assume concavity, and they deal with NP-complete problems, and they do these machine learnings. And so it's, from that vantage point, like, it's lovely to see the smartest people on the planet with lots of resources are engaged in hill climbing and search on their own performance landscape. So I kind of, at a meta level, you know, this is what actual, you know, this is not what the pretend people do. This is what really smart people, real people do with enormous resources, okay? They're solving things through heuristic search, maybe fancier than my models, but fundamentally, you know, that's how smart engineers try to be smart in complex worlds. They don't do it by assuming concavity.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna actually, since we are talking about the sort of moment that we're in, I'm gonna pass it on to Elena and let her ask her question about, you know, the direction for the field. Elena, you wanna?
Thanks. So, well, first, thank you very much, Dan. It was very interesting to hear you sharing your insights. So when I started doing my PhD, like what I was told that, oh, you know, you have to figure out what's the, you know, gap in the theory, or maybe contract two theories, and that's how you write a paper. But kind of in the recent years, I noticed that, for example, you know, in SMJ, there's a whole bunch of papers that are motivated more like through a phenomenon. Like, for instance, they say, oh, we're interested in understanding how pharmaceutical alliances happen, or like how platforms and video game developers interact, and like both the motivation, but even sometimes the theory is kind of driven by the phenomenon. Yeah. Yeah, and also kind of maybe, I don't know if it's correct to say replication studies, like kind of papers which maybe revisit certain questions, but with a novel research design. So basically, I'm curious, like, what's your opinion? Where do you think the strategy field is moving when you think about these different directions?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you know, I never was a true insider, but as a more peripheral observer of economics, I mean, you look at, you know, you did a time series analysis of the American Economic Review, you know, the shift from theory to empirics. So it's not, so to say, it's not just strategy. You're actually seeing a similar kind of shift from kind of a dominance around theory to what the hell is going on in the world. And then economists like, oh, well, sociologists have sort of already told us, but we'll rediscover it and we'll slightly maybe better econometrics and feel better about it. But I think you're right. So we're sort of, and it's, you know, I'm not quite sure, you know, whether, you know, what the sort of causal explanation for the shift. Is it, you know, a next generation of scholars saying, hey, we actually like care about real stuff, and, you know, let's stop, you know, we don't want to just make up a set of abstract concepts. We actually want to, you know, have some traction in the world. Is it, you know, to some degree opportunity driven? You know, the sort of sets of data sets availability has changed, right? So, you know, CompuStat is not the only island I can play in, and we got all these other kind of data structures. And I think maybe another element in the mix, you know, so there can be descriptive stuff, but the hurdle on have you identified, you know, you're making this claim and you're telling me test it, the hurdle rate on have you tested has gotten really hot. So one way around that is, well, let me just tell you about this phenomenon. And this phenomenon raises some interesting issue. And I gave that example as an editor, encouraging some people to do that. You know, don't pretend you're testing, because A, you didn't even have a particularly coherent theoretical story in some of those cases, or no, your data is really not quite up to it. So I think it may lead to some bifurcation, you know, where the identification hurdle is so high, let's just have a different genre that's operating. It's probably all the above, you know, but I think, you know, I you know, thinking about evolutionary systems, you care and value diversity. So there is diversity. I think, you know, shouldn't feel like, oh, because the world, you know, the modal paper now looks like X and it used to look like X prime. That's kind of interesting in the sociology of science and so on. I'm not sure it should have any impact on any of us behaviorally, what we do as individuals, right? So it doesn't, just because the modal paper has shifted some of its characteristics, you know, I like this genre, this is the kind of thing I like doing, you still get a publication. It is certainly no truth. You know, I want to do a theory testing paper. The standards around that, you know, have risen. So I think, yeah, in ways maybe kind of nice. The world is sort of opened up to the kind of descriptive. I mean, the replication issue. Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, Lori Rosenkopf has wrote me in after I said no a couple of times. We're actually finishing up a working paper on my own version of addressing or melding of Lori and Dan on it. So I think, you know, for me, there's the less interesting version of replication of, oh, were you a dodgy, evil person? And really, the sophomores who you tested in your psych experiment really didn't, you know, they did eat the marshmallow and you lied. Or you so primed them that that's why they didn't, you know, you painted the marshmallow green and you didn't tell us that it was green. You know, I think the more, you know, there was the SMJ piece on quasi-replication, so we're sort of pushing that a bit further. You know, since we're not just dealing, you know, there's no proof outside of physics or something, you know, even the college sophomore will be tainted by that experiment. So there's never a pure replication, you know, in another point in time with another population. And in our cases, you know, semiconductor industry in the 90s, biotech in the, you know, the next century, whatever, context matters. And so really, it seems to me, you know, what Lori and I are making a pitch, and we're almost done with our working paper. You know, it's kind of, you know, it's a problem of trying to kind of get to some more meso level and generalization around what we're doing. So I think about it, you know, partly as an org learning person, I've been intrigued by the problem of generalization. So of course I think about the quasi-replication problem kind of in that lens. And so I think it's interesting. It's not that somebody was dodging a bad person. It's what made semiconductors different from biotech, and let's begin to make that kind of a theoretical interest. And again, I think as data availability changes, our kind of the possibility for triangulating that way is going to be increasing. And so, you know, it seems to me the interesting question is not, oh, my statistics are slightly different than the prior paper. Yeah, you know, the why and what's the underlying kind of speculation about context effects. I might explain it. Of course, we also have our challenges of measures, right? So we have our kind of poverty often of like what the data sets are going to give us in measures, and even things like, oh, it's an alliance, but the alliance in software is a fundamentally different animal than an alliance in biotech. So at a phenomenological level, they have the same label, but kind of, you know, in substance, they're really possibly quite different animals. And that's another way in which sort of this, oh, we got different results. Well, yeah, because you know, it really actually was underlying a different kind of phenomena. We just use the same semantic label in ways that heightened similarity beyond what was going on. So I think there, you know, the sort of not the finger wagging version, but the sort of fodder for further theorizing and sense making. You know, pretty, you know, kind of interesting. And maybe it's, you know, back to one of Asim's earlier question, was that a sign of what a field maturity where like, catch your breath, let's consolidate and get our story straight here a little bit. You know, which is not, that's a crazy thing. But back to your, yes, there's been a shift. I think it's interesting. I think we can have some reasons why. But maybe back to my quixotic approach to things. I find it interesting, but I'm not sure, you know, don't live in an iron cage. You've kind of chosen this kind of interesting profession, hold to your passions, you know, triangulate enough to the world or anchor enough that you like, yes, you get some publications and you stay employed and so on, but fundamentally, wow, what a gift we have. Like, I mean, the amount of, yes, we have certain obligations, but the amount of freedom we have to kind of follow this inner drummer is pretty amazing.
So we, thanks, Dan. So I think we have time for maybe a couple of more questions. So I'm gonna pass it on to Rich. Rich, you had a question in the chat. You wanna ask that?
Sure. This may be a risky question, Dan.
Risky
First of all,
not you, but yeah.
First of all, thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it. It's great. It's especially great for the doctoral students, you know. So the question I put in the chat is, what was the best rookie job talk you've ever seen, other than your own students, of course? And what made it so great?
Oh, God. You think I remember this stuff?
I hope that you remember one.
Somebody gave a talk and Warren blew me away. Well, you know, we just hired one. We have Ronnie's on the call. Pretty awesome talk, Ronnie. You know, we have a recency effect. But God, I don't. And that's also, yeah, really dangerous. Oh my God! So I remember like a different version of this, but back to my, you know, parental kind of perspective that I wrote a letter of recommendation on a PhD student. And as you might imagine at this life point, given I have lots of PhD students out in the world, former PhD students are reading these letters. So this is the opposite. They're like, oh, Dan, you said X was pretty good, but you know, you didn't really position X relative to like Y and Z, where Y and Z, of course, include this individual. I'm like, yeah, what kind of idiot do you think I am? I mean, in lots of ways I'm an idiot, but I'm not that stupid. Like, you know, let me share with all my former doctoral students where I think, you know, they rank relative to this rookie. But so I don't know. I'll give a different answer. So I won't give your answer, but I'll answer a version of that question. Okay.
Okay.
One of the things I really key on when looking at job talk, rookie job talk papers, this is back to my feeling of like all works imperfect. So when those issues get presented to the person, and it's a high stress position, I kind of think like there's sort of three modal kind of responses. One is the, you know, no, don't bug me. Me, my advisor, I really think this is pretty great. The sort of flip side of that, but fundamentally the same, is the obsequious, oh my God, thank you. Let me write it down. And like, okay, you're doing that, but you're not thinking. I don't know. The middle ground of, let me take it in. Let me make sure I understand the issue you're raising. Let me entertain the possibility, the dual possibility of both, maybe I just didn't communicate clearly and actually, no, we don't have a problem here. Or, you know, I've considered it, you know, you're right. That's a limitation of my work. Or maybe actually, you know what? I think I can kind of push and in some ways address. It's really hard to do the third thing. And I think that there's just individual differences around in this high stress situation. I think it takes a level of confidence that it's back to that kind of giving yourself time. So at a kind of, and maybe it's even better, so it's a version of your question, like, characteristically, what stands out for me as a strong job taught is when somebody can do the third thing, because that's actually fairly rare. The more typical is at some level, don't bug me, or if I'm a doormat and roll over, does it mean you'll like stop asking me this question? We can all move on. To I'm going to actually engage. And I'm not going to be hostile, but I'm not going to, I'm going to like, just because you said there's unobserved heterogeneity, I shouldn't go cry now. Like, let's like carry it the next step. Like, what were you worried about here? What is this counterfactual that you're like thinking you'd be all clever about with me?
Yeah.
Or, you know what? In a sincere way, not the obsequious, that's actually kind of interesting. I'm not sure I can do this paper, maybe there's some data. That impresses me because, again, it's a journey. Any work is imperfect. So if somebody shows me they can listen, learn, and be open-minded, like, whoa, that person's gonna have a future, I may not love the job. I may actually not love the particular paper, but that's somebody I might want to bet on, because you put them in a kind of rich feedback environment, they're going to grow and develop. And so it's almost that characteristic that I'm keen on. So that's sort of, it's not a focus, but so I do have a strong point of view, but it's of that, how they as a learner engage in the context. And I think it actually is fairly predictive.
I think I'm going to take that video clip and show it to my doctoral students. That's a really good point.
So I know we have many questions, but we only have time for one. And so since, we started this conversation with principal agent models, if I'm just an agent for Samina, I'm going to let her exercise her right as principal and ask the last question.
Now we do have power. Okay.
Yeah, power in politics. There you go.
I wish. Thanks, Asim. Well, Dan, I have a few quick questions. And so we have like 6 minutes. So I need like 1-sentence responses, okay?
Nice. That's hard for me, okay? That, yeah.
But stuff we want to know. So a person was pivotal in your life, in your childhood.
In my childhood?
Mm-hmm.
If we say childhood, I mean, this may be too prosaic, but I'd say my father, and not, anyone's parents is pivotal, but as the intellectually rigorous scientist, and he also, I'm cheating, it's more than 1 sentence, but he got a PhD in physics. Then he goes off, he gets involved in a NASA project, exobiology, learns some genetics, goes to the Defense Department, learns about robotics, becomes a deputy dean in the engineering school. So all at Stanford, so, not a dilettante, but there's sort of there's a kind of, he could pick up in the intellectual engagement. Let me read Chomsky on linguistics. I heard this was interesting. The sort of fearless intellectualism and the, I don't take stuff for granted. Like I'm asked, so I remember as a PhD said, Dan, why are you economists so obsessed with closed form models? Like what the hell, with the engineering school, like what? But in any case, so it's sort of, yes, there's the parental things, but him as a kind of modeling kind of rigorous and fearless intellectualism as a little person, that was kind of pivotal in this context.
Okay. What is your favorite dessert?
Contrary again, I'm not a big, so a friend of mine just recently baked me some banana bread. So I'm more like the bread, sweet thing. I'm not like the tiramisu, whatever, oh, too rich. So I like, coffee crave. So yeah, I'm not, if you go sweet, kind of give me more like the morning sweet kind of thing, not the evening sweet.
All right, morning sweet versus evening sweet. I'll
eat it in the evening, but I'm just saying the more typical sort of bread meets sugar kind of sweet. I don't want the sort of straight on, really rich, creamy, no cream or not, that's so, if you're anybody's, yeah. So.
Awesome. All right, you've probably traveled the world. What is your favorite city?
like back to the favorite children thing. What is with you people? Favorites, okay, so I've spent a lot of time in Italy over the years. Now I think part of why I like Italy, it's a counterpoint to my, I don't know, work focus. It brings out the sort of playful and the chaotic that I kind of don't otherwise kind of. I mean, I joke with people like I grew up in paradise. It's called Palo Alto. So and I didn't quite realize that. So I don't know. Favorite, they're different. Okay, here's a news flash. So this again, where you can't stop you talking to me. I'm bad. So I am now under contract. Crazy big reveal to the world of a 50-acre quasi farm in Vermont. My reaction to the sheltered in place in the virus, maybe overreaction. My New York son, I blame him as an enabler. But yeah, I could be in the maple syrup biz shortly, although I don't think I will monetize that possibility, but I will have a small, but I'm in a portfolio. Like you want your hilltop town, Palo Alto, Vermont, Center City, Philadelphia, not so bad.
So we might.
I don't play favorites.
All right. But I'm looking forward to the Leventhal maple syrup from Vermont.
I thought about the branding opportunities. Yeah, so this lovely couple who are selling me, they're excluding the machinery in the sugar house. I didn't know what a sugar house was, but that's where the magic happens. You take your sap, you add heat, and it becomes, as my younger son says, the liquid gold. But I think, a future meeting for strategy science. So I'm thinking summer camp, my sugar house, fine, take the equipment, we're gonna put a bed in there. It's a beautiful log cabin. So yeah, so I'm gonna give up the branding opportunity.
All right, we'll meet you in Vermont. One last question. What does Dan Leventhal do for fun or to unwind?
It's a good question.
I didn't ask.
I bought a farm in Vermont, like I'm trying. So work's pretty fun. But I think you're thinking about non-work. I mean, I think you're like, I read some. I got my little occasional binge TV. Just finished Rami, which is an amazing series. Kind of the book I was going to mention also is a multi-identity thing. This is amazing. He's this, Egyptian guy in Jersey. He has multiple identities. Am I North American? Am I Egyptian? Very funny, charming, heartfelt series. Highly recommended on Hulu. Kind of normal stuff. I don't know. Not that interesting. I don't like. I don't have falconry. I don't like the exotic hunting. But I have a new hobby. I have to take care of this crazy property I just bought. But I hear the Wilcoxes next door are going to take over the wheat. I can't even say what the hell they're doing, but they're going to plow my wheat fields twice a year, as I understand it. There's an interesting Vermont barter system. So some competent soul, in my case the Wilcoxes, take care of the whole wheat stuff. But by legitimating the fact that this has the characteristics of the farm, I pay near zero property tax and I get a look at this beautiful field. So it's a nice win-win. It seems to be a very central part of the Vermont economy that I'm learning about. So that's my new hobby, Vermont.
Vermont, 50 acres in Vermont.
Exactly. So come next summer, come visit. The sugar house. Well, I also, not to get too excited here, but I also have a yurt. We have another now, this is probably sold a house oh my God, who could not fall in love with a farmhouse with a sugar house and a yurt?
And a yurt.
Glamping.
A yurt. I've only heard about yurts.
Yeah, right. Well, come to, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Okay.
I'll have to send you some overalls.
Yeah, well, right. I'm sort of like that old TV show Green Acres, that sort of
exactly
effectual big city guy.
Yeah. I want to know what you're doing for the Wilcoxes.
Through his ineptness, but
overalls and a pitchfork.
Yeah. I'm not. No, the Wilcoxes. Okay, I know my limitations. There's a nice study there, okay? And I have a fiber, I have a satellite internet connection. We're all good.
Well, on behalf of the division, Dan, I want to thank you for making the time today. I think we
Okay,
all
it's
learned
been a lot of fun.
had a lot of fun.
Useful. All right.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it to Asim for a final farewell.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for attending as well. So, you know, thank you all for being here. It's been lovely, and have a good night.
Thanks. Take care.
Good night.